In 1939, Britain ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. It controlled a quarter of the world's landmass and a quarter of its population. The pound sterling was accepted everywhere. It was the global reserve currency. The Royal Navy dominated every ocean. In short, Britain was a true superpower, unquestionably so. But look at what happened just 17 years later. By 1956, Britain had to ask the United States for permission to manage even its own affairs. In 1967, the pound collapsed, and in 1976, the ultimate humiliation came. Britain went begging to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Think about that. An empire that ruled the world for 200 years became an ordinary European country in just 30 years. What do history books usually tell you? Independence movements rose, people became morally enlightened, colonialism ended, and so on. Sure, that's partly true, but it's not the real reason. Britain lost its empire because it went bankrupt, not morally but financially. They won World War II militarily, but they lost it economically. Now I'll explain exactly how Britain destroyed itself, how America replaced it, and why this happened. This story matters today because of what we see happening in the United States. The British Empire didn't say, "We're done." It ended because the money ran out. After World War I, Britain was at its peak. In 1920, it spanned 13.7 million square miles, nearly a quarter of the world's land surface. It ruled 458 million people, about 1/5 of the world's population. It had territory on every continent. The sun truly never set on the empire, but its real power wasn't land, it was money. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. International trade ran on sterling. Countries held their savings in pounds. London was unquestionably the world's financial center. Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. British banks financed projects everywhere. British investors owned railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, farmland in India, companies on 6 continents. What did this financial power mean? Britain could borrow at the lowest interest rates in the world. That meant it could finance massive armies cheaply. It ran its empire on debt. By controlling currency and credit, it controlled global trade. The system was based on the gold standard. Sterling was backed by physical gold at a fixed rate. This wasn't just a number. It meant the pound had real, tangible value. You could walk into a bank and exchange paper money for actual gold. That's why it was trusted. That's why it became the global reserve currency. Britain's economy wasn't the largest in absolute terms. The United States had already surpassed it. But for an island nation of just 44 million people, its output was extraordinary, second only to America. British coal, steel, textiles, and machinery powered the world. And behind it all stood the Royal Navy, still the largest and most powerful fleet on Earth. In 1920, Britain looked invincible, but financially, cracks had already begun to form. The first major shock came from World War I. Between 1914 and 1918, the war cost Britain about £35 billion. That may not sound huge today, but relative to its economy at the time, it was catastrophic. For perspective, in 1914, Britain's entire GDP was around £2.5 billion. The war cost 14 times its annual economic output. Think about that. Where did the money come from? First, taxes. Britain massively raised taxes. Income tax, which had been nearly zero for most people before the war, rose to as high as 30%. But even that wasn't enough. Second, borrowing. Britain borrowed heavily from its own citizens through war bonds, but more importantly, it took enormous loans from the United States. For the first time, Britain became indebted to America. By 1918, national debt had risen from £650 million to £7.4 billion, an 11-fold increase in just 4 years. Third, asset sales. To pay for weapons and supplies, Britain sold off its overseas investments. Before the war, it owned enormous assets abroad. After the war, much of that wealth had been liquidated. Then there was the currency problem. In 1914, Britain abandoned the gold standard to print money for the war. A currency that had been as good as gold for centuries suddenly became just paper. In 1925, Britain tried to return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This was a massive mistake. The pound became overvalued, British goods became expensive and uncompetitive, and the economy was strangled. The 1920s were marked by deflation and high unemployment. The damage was done, but it was hidden. Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor into a major debtor. America had transformed from debtor to creditor. Global financial power had shifted, but few people noticed. On the surface, Britain still appeared to rule the world. Financially, it was hanging by a thread. World War I was expensive, but World War II was the real disaster. The Second War cost Britain another £28 billion. But again, the absolute number doesn't tell the story. Relative to its shattered economy, the burden was unbearable. Britain fought World War II with total mobilization. At the peak of the war, an astonishing 55% of the country's GDP went to military spending. The entire economy was devoted to survival. Food, fuel, clothing. Everything was rationed. Every resource was redirected toward one goal: staying alive. This was completely unsustainable. Britain burned through its remaining wealth, sold assets, and borrowed at a pace that would bankrupt any country. By 1941, Britain was on the brink of collapse. That's when America stepped in with the Lend-Lease program. The U.S. would supply Britain with weapons, food, and materials to be paid back after the war. But this was not charity. The U.S. charged interest, and in exchange for this lifeline, Britain had to accept American conditions. What were those conditions? Britain had to dismantle imperial trade privileges, open its empire to American trade and investment, and accept American financial oversight. In essence, Britain was trading its empire for survival. America was buying global dominance at a discount. The result was a debt explosion. By 1945, Britain's national debt had reached 250% of GDP. Let that sink in. Debt equal to 2.5 times the entire economy. For comparison, U.S. debt today is about 123% of GDP. Greece, at the height of its debt crisis, reached around 180%. Britain in 1945 was in a league of its own. It was total catastrophe. To service this debt, Britain sold everything it could. Overseas investments were liquidated. Gold reserves vanished. Foreign properties, artworks, buildings, anything of value was sold. By 1945, Britain had completed its transformation from the world's largest creditor to one of its largest debtors. It took just 30 years and 2 world wars. Britain was now fully dependent on the United States. From 1945 onward, it owed the U.S. more than $4.3 billion, a modest number on paper, but crushing for a devastated economy. To survive, to feed its population, Britain relied on American credit. Even before the war ended, the U.S. and Britain met at Bretton Woods to design the post-war financial system. Britain was represented by the brilliant economist John Maynard Keynes, who proposed a neutral international currency. But the U.S., represented by Harry Dexter White, had a different plan. The dollar would become the new reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. After 2 world wars, bankrupt Britain had no leverage to object. All the power lay with the United States, and just like that, the dollar replaced the pound. This was not a technical change. It was the most important transfer of power of the 20th century. What does it mean to issue the reserve currency? It means everyone needs your money to trade. It creates constant global demand for your currency. You can run massive trade deficits indefinitely. You can borrow at the lowest interest rates. Your financial system dominates the world. Britain had enjoyed these privileges for 200 years. Overnight, they were transferred to America. A crisis for sterling followed immediately. Britain tried to defend the pound, but the fundamentals were broken. Debt was 250% of GDP. The economy was wrecked. Trade deficits were large. The dollar was king. The pound was overvalued, and everyone knew it. But admitting that meant admitting Britain was no longer a great power. The first humiliation came in 1949. Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%, from $4.30 to $2.80. Great powers don't devalue their currencies, but Britain had no choice. Britain could no longer afford the costs of its empire. Just think about the expense. Military garrisons all over the world, navies in every ocean, vast colonial administrations, infrastructure investments, and constant fighting against independence movements. Britain's economy was about half the size of America's, yet it was trying to maintain a global footprint. The math simply didn't add up. The breaking point came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. Egyptian leader Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, vital for oil transport from the Middle East. Britain, which owned 44% of the canal company, refused to accept this. Along with France and Israel, it launched a military operation to retake the canal. Militarily, the operation succeeded. Within days, British and French forces occupied the canal zone. Then, America intervened. President Eisenhower was furious. He opposed the operation and threatened Britain not with bombs, but with financial destruction. The U.S. threatened sanctions, oil embargoes, and, most critically, to dump its massive sterling holdings, which would have collapsed the currency. It also blocked Britain's urgently needed IMF loans. This was financial blackmail. Britain's foreign exchange reserves were evaporating. Sterling was collapsing. The U.S. issued a clear ultimatum: withdraw from Suez or face total financial ruin. Britain had no choice. Despite military victory, it withdrew in humiliation. Suez revealed the New World Order. British military power meant nothing without American financial approval. The empire was an illusion. The strings were pulled in Washington. Prime Minister Eden resigned in disgrace. Sterling came under renewed attack. Independence movements across the empire accelerated after seeing Britain's weakness. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound once again, another 14% cut. Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television and told the British public that the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. This was a lie, a desperate lie. It was the second major devaluation in less than 20 years. Why did this keep happening? Britain was trapped in a vicious cycle of consuming more than it produced and running chronic trade deficits. If you have the reserve currency, you can manage this. But Britain no longer did. It had to pay for imports in foreign currency and was constantly running out of it. The Bank of England tried to defend the pound by selling reserves and raising interest rates, but it was a lost battle. Devaluation was always inevitable. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Britain came to be known as the sick man of Europe. The country was paralyzed by stagflation, that is, high inflation combined with economic stagnation. Strikes shut down industry. The energy crisis made everything worse. Manufacturing collapsed and a brain drain began. The most talented Britons went to America. Britain, the richest country in the world just 50 years earlier, was now in a managed process of decline. The greatest humiliation came in 1976. Facing yet another currency collapse, Britain went begging for a bailout from the IMF it had helped to create. The IMF agreed, but imposed harsh conditions: cut government spending, raise interest rates, impose austerity. A country that had once ruled a quarter of the world was now taking orders from international bureaucrats. During this period, Britain rapidly dismantled its empire. In 1947, India and Pakistan. In 1957, Malaya. In the 1960s, most African colonies. And the last major possession, Hong Kong, was handed over in 1997. The official story was moral enlightenment, a graceful granting of independence. The reality was this: Britain was bankrupt. Every colony was a burden on the treasury. The empire had to go because the bills could no longer be paid. So, what is the lesson? Britain's decline followed a clear pattern. 1. Massive debt from wars. 2. Loss of reserve currency status. 3. Running chronic deficits by consuming more than it produces. 4. Repeated currency devaluations. 5. Dependence on foreign creditors. 6. Loss of political independence and asset sell-offs. Now look at today's America. Debt accumulation. $35 trillion and rising from endless wars and spending. Erosion of the dollar's reserve status. Slow but happening. Persistent trade deficits. Yes. Currency pressure. The dollar has lost more than 86% of its purchasing power since 1971. Rising debt costs. Interest payments on the national debt now exceed the entire defense budget. Growing constraints on action. Absolutely. For Britain, the final stage was imperial liquidation. For America, the frightening question is, what will we liquidate? The critical difference is speed. Britain's fall from dominant global empire to an IMF bailout case took roughly 30 years. In today's hyper-fast, tightly interconnected financial world, the distance Britain covered in 30 years could, if current trends continue, be traversed by America in half the time. History's warning is very clear. Britain did not choose to end its empire. It was forced to by financial reality. Empires do not end because of moral progress. They end because they go bankrupt. Financial power is the only real power. Military power is meaningless if you cannot afford to sustain it. And possessing the world's reserve currency is the ultimate superpower. Britain learned this the hard way. America may be next.